Covert fifth columns. Covert fifth columns. This is Central Command calling all covert fifth columns. Is it like that? Is that how the system operates? No. As I said before, it is compartmentalized, distributed, and decentralized. However, this does not mean that it does not operate with an efficiency tantamount to one centralized, integrated, and unified form of organization. In fact, it does, but in order for that to be effective, it must be proportionately covert from one level to the next lower level in the organization in which the covert fifth column is constituted. In other words, it must have plausible deniability within its own ranks, and it must have the ability to enforce control in a top-down hierarchical structure. And in order for that to be maintained, obviously, it's not possible to get away with allowing anything other than a compartmentalized, decentralized, and distributed form of organization. Given that parameter of the analysis, we can proceed from the effect to the cause of the effect. We can proceed from the effect to the cause with far more accuracy, because often the attempt to study a phenomenon depends very definitively on the model that one hypothesizes for its investigation, because one can't start without some hypothetical model. One observes the phenomenon, then creates a model that attempts to explain it in terms of a cause, and then one proceeds to investigate whether or not that proposed cause properly models an explanation for the effect, the proposed effect, the phenomenon that you're observing. So let's just say that there are some phenomena that can be directly observed by persons who are familiar with what would have been the norm, and then therefore deviations from the norm can be directly observed. It's absurd to declare that such capabilities are somehow just fanciful constructions, because in fact it's presumed that there's some norm by which the distinction between an objectively observable deviation and a norm and what would be merely a fanciful construction exists. But then that presumes the very model of cognition that it proposes to hypercynically doubt, and therefore reveals rather a bad faith effort to debilitate a particular model rather than a kind of model as such. Namely, it's a fallacious attempt to underscore doubt in the model of the proposed model that observations of a deviation from a norm can be detected reliably by individuals familiar with that norm, and then whose faculties are in sufficient working order so as to detect deviations in that norm. I'm not proposing anything extreme when I suggest that it's plainly observable that certain types of behavior are not expected to occur under certain types of conditions, and that if they were to occur at all, or let alone to an exaggerated degree of frequency or intensity, that it would seem absurd to believe there's not an explanation for that deviation from the norm. If every person you walk up to on the street winks at you, or coughs or hawks a loogie and spits into the gutter, you either have to believe that that's going on at a fantastic rate with nothing to do with your presence, or you have to believe that it correlates strongly with your coming into contact with those individuals. If it were only that it correlated with your coming into contact with those individuals, then you would not see this conduct occurring outside of a certain distance from your presence. But without affirming the consequent, or rather affirming the antecedent by noting the consequent, you note that, for example, it does not occur at a certain distance from your presence. This strongly correlates with it having something to do with your presence. You may model that your presence to a phenomenon is strongly correlated with it if you see that outside of your presence, that phenomenon does not occur nearly at the rate that it does in your presence. It's not an unreasonable conjecture. If it were occurring at a great distance, and this could be reliably found out to be the case, at a rate and intensity found in your presence, then you could reasonably model that it's independent of your presence. So, in the same way that that strongly correlates with that model, it's also not impossible that it does still correlate with your presence. It's just that at the same time, it correlates with factors other than your presence, and so that it can be found at a great distance. But if, in fact, in the same way that if it strongly correlates with your presence by being found absent outside your presence, this doesn't mean that it's not a coincidence that could be explained by another cause than your presence, but could be explained perhaps by something which is correlatively consistent with your presence. So, for example, if for some reason, let's just say, what would be a good example? If you were dressed up like a giant banana and walking down the street, people might react in various ways to that phenomenon. You might hear more comments you might overhear the word banana quite frequently in the conversations of passers-by or people that you pass on the street. And that would be consistent with your presence only because your presence is manifested in the form of a giant banana. Independently of that, if you want to investigate whether it has something to do with you per se, you'd have to, of course, not dress that way, and then see if this phenomenon persists. It's unlikely, for example, in many cases, that something would occur for any sensible reason based upon simply correlating the observable phenomena. So I can see no reason for people to cough per se in my presence at a rate or with an intensity outside the norm. I don't see myself as in any way the proximal cause of such an event. However, my presence may signal the triggering of some sort of cause which leads to that effect. For example, if there were a psychotronics control grid, and if Lilly waves were emitted through directed energy signals as found in Wi-Fi and Li-Fi signals, and as well as through perhaps other scalar interferometric or other types of directed energy patterns, then it is possible that the signature of a person could be identified by various means, such as devices they're carrying, nanotechnological implants, or inhaled from the smart dust being sprayed on all the major cities. Things like that could easily come into effect. There could be dedicated surveillance protocols for that individual in the panopticonic surveillance grid, which we know exists. And all these could be integrated. And with the result that a certain person's position could be monitored constantly, and anyone else's position relative to them could be monitored. And it could be defined as a systematic program that if this person is in certain environments under certain conditions, then anyone in the environment with them at a certain distance will be incited by direct stimulation of any of these directed energy vectors to cough or behave in some manner that is designated by the protocol. This individual just came in through the back door and then suddenly left through the back door for no apparent reason. So I'd include him in the movie. I think he left when he saw that I was recording. Didn't want to be on film. Who knows what he wanted to do? Maybe he wanted to cough. Because I think at the same time such a protocol exists, this doesn't rule out witting agents. It doesn't rule out those who might get a kick out of being consciously complicit in such a program. And it may be necessary for them to enter the scene in order to correlate an already sensitized stimulus to some other pattern of behavior that they wish to start to entrain into the protocol, which could then be run automatically through the algorithms of the quantum supercomputing array that no doubt integrates information from the fusion centers with the panopticonic surveillance grid, with the psychotronics control/influence grid, which is definitely in existence and deployed in our urban infrastructures under the guise of being these other handy technologies which are available to us, such as smartphones. So right then and there, an integration of all the types of technology which I've discussed in Covert Fifth Columnry has already been explicated. What other further examples are there? Well, it's known that there are norms and patterns for all sorts of behavior, such as how someone walks or negotiates walking in a finite space with other people who may be walking in the same or the opposite direction, such as a sidewalk. Same with driving down the street. The list goes on and on. Anytime there's a finite amount of space and people have to negotiate without running into each other and colliding, there are certain temporal lobe and other neurological functions which come online in order to negotiate the sense of spatial awareness and the sense of bodily integrity that may be at stake in maximizing and optimizing the ability to navigate around one another rather than through one another. Okay? These can become rather automatic in that a person becomes less conscious of these functions and operates more, let's say, oblivious to them, but can become aware of them if there is any kind of glitch which necessitates it, such as someone veering toward them at an unconscious, seemingly looking like a zombie because looking down or in some other direction, or because of having any other type of condition that might prohibit their awareness of where they're walking. And their vector of approach could be indicative of a collision course. If they're looking down at their cell phone, not looking around them, for example, taking no responsibility for their environmental awareness and leaving that to others to navigate around them, of course, that's a dangerous precedent to allow people to set. I think it's better to alert people to what the hell's going on and say, hey, look where you're going. Or some other way of alerting them to the fact that consciously or unconsciously, they're vectoring on you. You're looking where you're going. They're not. They have no excuse. They need to wake the hell up. And if this process goes on long enough times, it can become exasperating, annoying, distracting. One would like to be focused on other things than a zombie vectoring in on collision course with his head up his ass and his cell phone stuck in his head. This is an annoying condition to run into over and over again. Let's say that it were the norm that it happened, 20% of the time you ran into somebody on a sidewalk. Let's say that suddenly jumped up to, say, 70% of the time. Let's just say that it happened when people weren't not looking where they're going, but in spite of looking where they're going, decided to want to vector. Or basically, if enough persons vector in on you past the norm of when that might happen by accident or even by intention, it's going to be detectable because